Rackhams, a British department store that opened in Birmingham in 1881 on Corporation Street, and the name, a byword of luxury. In 1955, Rackams became a part of the world-renowned Harrods Group, and in 1959, it was purchased by House of Fraser. Behind Rackams, next to Pigeon Park, was what was known as a red light district, and so the term, the back of Rackams, became used as a phrase amongst Brummies as a byword for prostitution. Rackams became well known for its annual festive grottos, drawing in many visitors to its stores during the Christmas period for this reason. And during the January sales, people even camped outside the store overnight. Rackams was well known for its cosmetic stands as well as its perfume counters. And in the 1960s, the Lilac Tree restaurant was opened on the 6th floor of the store. There was a ground floor hall and a bridal wear department on the 2nd floor, and the store was open 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and served more than 20,000 customers a week. But during the Christmas shopping season of 1994, an event would happen inside Rackham's store that would shock the nation and make headlines. This is the story of what's been dubbed as the Rackhams Slasher. On December the 8th, 1994, at around 10:10 in the morning, Rackham's shop was busy and packed out with Christmas shoppers. It was the busiest day of the week. Karen Crosby, aged 35, was working on the Estee Lauder perfume counter of Rackham's as a saleswoman, when suddenly someone lunged at her from behind. She was grabbed by the head and her throat was then slashed with a knife. As Karen turned to see what was happening, she saw a knife man raise a 12-inch knife above her head. In shock, Karen put her hand up to try to defend herself and to try to protect her face, and her fingers were sliced off but still attached by the damaged tendons. The knife man was 31-year-old David Cedric Morgan of Osborne Tower, Gladstone Street, Aston, Birmingham. And after slashing Karen Crosby, she fell to the floor, whilst David Morgan stood over her, playing with the knife before moving on. 50-year-old Jan Twining was browsing through Christmas cards when she felt a tap on her shoulder. As she turned to see who it was, David Morgan slashed her across the neck. Eyewitness Tony Parker of Sutton Coldfield said, "I was coming down from the first floor escalators when I saw a man holding a shop assistant near the Estee Lauder perfume counter around the throat with a knife. She was screaming, 'Keep away from me! Keep away from me!' Her throat had been cut. Then he grabbed another woman and cut her throat. I couldn't believe what was happening." As the knife man walked through the store, he began randomly slashing at people without any provocation at all, grabbing women by the head and then slashing their throats. The shop turned into pandemonium, with eyewitness 21-year-old Claire Dalloway, who had been at a stand in the store promoting the National Lottery, saying that people were running and screaming, trying to get out of the way. She describes him as someone who just suddenly went crazy, thrashing about with this big knife. The knife man, David Morgan, was carrying a 12-inch knife as well as a smaller boning knife. All around him, screaming shoppers fled, while several victims pleaded with the attacker to spare them. 85-year-old Elsie Casworth, who was disabled, was also grabbed by the neck and had her throat cut and upon seeing the defenseless old lady bleeding from her neck wounds, security guard 27-year-old Tracy Hitchmer went over to help her, and the knife man slashed her throat too. Before slashing Tracy's throat, David Morgan had slashed her best friend and colleague, fellow security guard 38-year-old Joanne Evans' throat, who had been slashed from her chin to her throat. Joanne Evans said, "He knew what he was doing. He wanted to cut my throat. He took hold of my head and exposed my throat." She also said, "There was sheer pleasure on his face as he did it. To me, that is evil." 36-year-old Husna Chilwan, who had been in the store shopping with her mother, had witnessed the whole thing. She said, "He was very calm and didn't say a word when he walked into the shop. The man stayed totally calm. He just stood there playing with his knife." David Morgan continued around Rackams, randomly slashing the throat of women, and in total he slashed the throats of 14 women and injured one man. Jonathan Hayes worked in Principals, which was a shop nearby, said that he saw people who had been slashed across the throat. Some were on stretchers and some were walking around holding their throats, which had been split open. All entrances to the store were blocked by police wearing bulletproof vests. As David continued to slash and mutilate innocent victims, he was overpowered by 42-year-old civilian scenes of crime officer Keith Hart, as well as Sergeant James Lavery on the first floor of Rackams. As Sergeant James Lavery approached the knife man, he realised he didn't have his truncheon on him, so he picked up a golf club that he saw on a nearby stand to help him disarm the slasher. Although struggling and fighting with the police, David Morgan was apprehended and carried out into a police car. His knife was seized and the other knife was found nearby. Eyewitness 23-year-old Simon Wright of Ladywood said, "I saw a man laughing and smiling as officers led him away, handcuffed from the store. He looked like he was on something, like drugs. His eyes were bulging and he was laughing and smiling as they threw him into the car." The 15 victims suffered face and neck wounds, with 2 of them deemed serious. 1 had sliced fingers, and 10 people were treated for shock. A fleet of ambulances took the injured to hospital. 3 of the victims worked at Rackams. All 800 staff at Rackams were evacuated and taken to the Grand Hotel in Colmore Road, Birmingham, and placed in the Grosvenor Suite, where they were provided with tea and coffee. The whole ordeal had lasted just 10 minutes. The knife man, David Morgan, was charged with 9 offences of wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, assault, and 6 charges of attempted murder. The day after the knife man's rampage, on Friday the 9th of December 1994, David Morgan was brought to Birmingham Crown Court, but the trial was adjourned for a medical report because the NHS could not decide on his mental state, whether David Morgan was mentally ill or not. Friends of David Morgan described that despite having had a normal childhood, David was a loner who was obsessed with militarism and held a grudge against women who had shunned him. Digging deeper into his background, it was revealed that David Morgan had been admitted into All Saints Psychiatric Hospital 8 years earlier in 1988, where he was treated for manic depression after he'd attacked a female shop worker. He was released a few months later but was arrested again for another attack on another woman, but was given a conditional discharge. 2 days before his release from the psychiatric hospital, a female social worker had warned that David was a danger to women. The social worker had written a report on him, which said, "On reading his case notes, I realised that David is a very sick young man. Diagnosis not known. Sexual hang-ups, shoplifting offences, assault." Also in the report, the social worker had written about an incident that had occurred that had concerned her during a consultation she had had with David and a doctor, saying, "He continued to mutter and then ask me if I was married." Dr. Rauder interrupted at this point and told David not to ask personal questions. He disregarded this and continued to drill me on my personal life and sexual habits. David Morgan was then asked to leave the office and was removed by nursing staff. 2 months before the knife attack, David had told a nurse that he wanted to attack women, and he also told others that he had visions of wounding women, but nobody listened. Just a few weeks earlier, in September, David Morgan had gone to his GP to ask him for help to get his benefits increased. Probably sensing that something was wrong with him, the GP referred him to psychiatric services, where David was seen by a community psychiatric nurse and a consultant psychiatrist. But no grounds were found for compulsory admission into a psychiatric hospital. When later questioned about this, the psychiatric hospital responded by saying, "If we decided to lock everybody up who expressed any rage, we'd need another hospital the size of Winson Green." During his police interview, David Morgan told police that he had set out to wage war on white women after watching a TV programme that involved scenes about the British National Party. That programme was a BBC programme called Between the Lines, a complaints investigation bureau that probes into the darker side of the Metropolitan Police. The next morning, after watching the programme, David had gone on his knife rampage, slashing the throats of all white women he passed. Security guard Joanne Evans, who had had her neck slashed whilst helping the 85-year-old woman who had just had her neck slashed also, said, "As a security officer, I get accused of racism if I pull somebody black, but he wanted to hurt white women. I paid the price for being white." David Morgan also told a psychiatrist after his arrest that he chose Rackams because, quote, "You kill a better class of people there." During the trial, just over a year later, at Birmingham Crown Court, after David Cedric Morgan pled guilty, 6 attempted murder charges were dropped, but he still stood trial for the other charges. Victim Deanna Lawson, who was one of the women who had been slashed, said, "I am cut across my throat, but we can't call that attempted murder. We call it grievous bodily harm." During the trial, an NHS psychologist gave evidence saying that David Morgan was vulnerable and isolated, but suffered from no mental illness. The judge called David Morgan evil, brutal and remorseless, saying that he should be held until he was no longer a danger, adding that if that time never comes, then so be it. On Friday the 2nd of February 1996, David Cedric Morgan was given 10 life sentences with the judge saying that he would not be entitled for parole until he had served at least 12 years. Speaking after the verdict, Gwen Leeson, another victim who also had her throat slashed, said, "Justice hasn't been done. This man should be in a mental hospital, not a prison." The government began looking into an urgent review of the handling of mentally ill offenders. The Home Secretary, Michael Howard, ordered a shake-up of tribunals that decide whether people who have been classed as criminally insane are still a public risk or whether they can be released. He called for more experts on the decision panels and said that there was no going back to old days of widespread lunatic asylums, as they incarcerated many who posed no danger. Michael Howard went on to say that the pendulum may have swung too far in the other direction, with some mental patients being released into care in the community programs when tribunals should have more forensic psychologists and other professionals having an input, as there is not sufficient enough expertise to make safe judgments on releasing psychiatric patients. Karen Crosby, the first victim that was working at the Estee Lauder counter that had also had her finger severed, was haunted by the whole ordeal. Surgeons managed to attach her severed fingers and her hand was in plaster. She was back at work 8 weeks later, but due to the trauma of what had happened to her, she suffered a relapse and had to go on sick leave 9 months later. Joanne Evans, the security guard who had been slashed whilst rescuing the 85-year-old that had been slashed, needed 22 stitches to repair her slashed throat. She would also have to undergo more surgery in the future to reduce scarring. And although she tried to carry on, Joanne says her life fell apart 6 weeks after the attack. She split from her boyfriend because of her mood swings, which grew bad, caused by the trauma of the knife attack. Joanne said that the first thing she'd do in the mornings was look in the mirror at her slashed throat and cry, too scared to leave her house. Eventually, her GP warned her that she was heading towards a nervous breakdown and she was sent for counselling. Another victim of the knife attack, Kay Pilkington, also needed 12 stitches to repair her slashed throat. All the victims received just under £8,000 in compensation. Instead of prison, David Morgan was sent to Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital in Merseyside. But a year into his sentence, David Morgan was said to have gone berserk on the high dependency Shelley ward, attacking psychiatric nurse Steve Messenger with a razor blade, slashing him across his face and neck. The nurse ended up needing 30 stitches to his throat and face. 6 years after his sentencing, in 2002, David Morgan, who had been living at maximum security psychiatric hospital Broadmoor, was transferred to a medium security psychiatric unit, Hatherton Centre near Stafford, where he was allowed out on escorted trips outdoors as part of his rehabilitation. 2 years after this, in 2006, again as part of his rehabilitation, David Morgan, who was by then aged 43, was given day release to Stafford Town Centre, where he was seen in Asda, TK Maxx, and he was also seen drinking in the Chicago Rock Cafe bar. There have been no further reports on whether or not David Morgan has been released. In 2003, Rackhams Birmingham became House of Fraser.